Welcome to this installment of supplemental lectures provided by PNC's Concurrent Enrollment Program. My name is Alexandra Kindle, and I will share some information with you that comes out of my history courses at Purdue University North Central. This is the third installment in the lectures on the women's rights movement. This lecture covers the period of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era when women created a viable and successful movement to achieve gains for women's rights, including suffrage. Women used the momentum of reform in these areas to push their agenda, and therefore the theme of this lecture is an unexpected one. Women did not argue for the right to vote based on their claim to equality and humanity in American society. This was the argument of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the early years. The new generation of women will argue for the vote based on the differences between women and men. I'll say it again. Based on the differences between women and men. Keep in mind we cannot know what each woman felt. They may have truly believed men and women were equal and deserved the same treatment, but women argued for bringing their special virtues to American society to undo the harm men had done to cities, to politics, and to the private sphere. To this point, the women's movement had remained on the fringe. Most women and men were happy enough with the social status quo or too busy doing other things, such as, surviving, to worry about women's rights or getting women the vote. There were a few states in the West where residents gave women the vote, especially Wyoming and Utah, but there were special circumstances around these events. Overall, the efforts of the women involved in groups such as the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association were slow going. If you do not know who these people are or these groups, please take a moment to review in your textbook or listen to part 2 of this lecture series. But by the Gilded Age, American cities were growing, and so too were their problems. As Reconstruction came to an end, the opportunities and hope presented in the cities vied for attention with the disease and disruption caused by immigration and industrialization. The growth of urbanization, immigration, and industrialization occurred at once and brought new troubles to the American conversation. It became clear during the period that, to meet the needs of Americans in the changing economic milieu, cheap goods could be made with immigrant labor, bringing women and children into the public sphere. In places like sweatshops and factories and at home. In all these places, work dragged working-class women and children into wage and piece labor for the survival of their families. Since the 1840s, however, as cities emerged, ideas about the roles of women, children, and families in the urban arena developed. Middle-class people clung to the ideal of separate spheres, but with the economic changes after the Civil War and the rise of such a large working class of immigrants, there seemed to be a disjuncture between the ideal and the reality for too many women and children in places such as Chicago, New York City, and even Los Angeles. Middle-class women started reform efforts based on this ideal. Working-class women did not have the protections of class and gender that the middle-class ladies had, and young women were thrust into dangerous situations. Events such as the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire exploded all of these issues in 1911. Almost all women in the era wore the shirtwaist seen here, but only working-class women were making them. The ladies of privilege realized the benefits they reaped by not having to sew their families' clothes, or having to work in the factories, so they decided to help with organizing laborers and going on strike with the shirtwaist employees. Some of the makers conceded, but Triangle Shirtwaist Company did not. Poor ventilation, locked doors, and labor abuse led to a fire. Women were forced to jump from windows or burn alive. Images of burned and dead women forced change in New York City. It also proved to women's rights activists how limited women's influence was on politics. Overall, without an influence on politics, women involved in these kinds of events realized to make real change, they would need the vote. For suffragists, this seemed to be a way to convince many women and men that it truly was time to give women the vote. We will see middle-class reformers arguing for the vote based on private sphere concerns, such as working women making better homes. And of course, protecting children. Cities truly were dangerous places. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid swept through cities. In the 1880s, 10% of Chicago's population was wiped out by an epidemic. Crime and other dangers seemed to threaten the American social fabric, and women reformers argued this fell within their domain. For them, the problems of the cities were hurting women and children, and during the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, women reformers positioned themselves as the experts on families. Their domain was the private sphere. They were considered the homemakers, and thus should have some say on what threatened home and family. There were men reformers who agreed. Thus, women created a movement at the time referred to as social housekeeping. This represented women bringing their private sphere concerns to the public sphere with reform and sometimes the demand for the vote. With a voice in the public sphere, women could help those who had been forgotten in the halls of the city machines, the state legislators, and the Congress. This brought together a coalition of reformers, male and female. Muckrakers, of course, were running about the cities describing the world of the working classes in word and pictures. The last image of the boys spending their day poking a dead horse instead of learning how to spell horse was taken by a muckraker photographer named Jacob Riis. His book documented the lives of the other half for those who might not go into the bowels of the city. Then there are also thousands of women's clubs that became vehicles for reform and often supporters of giving the vote to women. Women formed clubs to clean up streets, plant trees, study the Bible, advocate for women workers and consumers, and so much more. In 1890, many of these clubs coordinated their individual voices under the banner of the General Federation of Women's Clubs. Just as unions during the Gilded Age came under the umbrella of the American Federation of Labor, these women combined their efforts for greater strength for reform first and later suffrage. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, or the WCTU, became one of the biggest and most influential clubs. In the 1870s, as cities grew and the influence of alcohol permeated everything from the workplace to politics, women brought their moral influence to bear on the issue. These women argued for the protection of women, children, and home against the deleterious effects of drunk men and rum-soaked city machines. With 250,000 members at one point, the WCTU became a focal point of the social housekeeping movement and the suffrage effort. The only way, it seemed, to rid the cities of saloons was to disconnect them from the political machines. Saloons and political machines were so intertwined that not one could be addressed without the other. In contrast to these male-oriented saloons and political machines, and this kind of male-oriented structure of the cities, settlement houses emerged to help immigrant families to adjust to their new lives, and the reformers that lived in these houses tended to focus on women and children whose needs were not addressed so directly by the machines. The reformers who lived in the settlement house were often referred to as residents, and many of them came from the middle and upper classes. Also, many of them were women. In 1895, Hull House, for example, had 20 residents. 90% were women. They had to have money because the job was unsalaried, and they had to pay for their room and board. Adams was convinced that the more privileged citizens needed to live in the neighborhood to truly understand the immigrants' problems and meet their needs. Now, Adams's Hull House was neither the only settlement house in the country nor in the city of Chicago. Historians, however, have a lot of information about it because Jane Addams was so active in promoting reform and suffrage. The settlement house is a great example of how women could justify their efforts for the public sphere based on private concerns. Settlement house residents surveyed the conditions of the ward to expose the problems of the cities to officials and voters who could start using ballots to make changes. They counted everything from sewers to schools. Hull House residents found that the community of the 19th Ward was not conducive to family life. In a ward of 50,000 people, there were 7 churches, 2 missions, 10 parochial schools, no public schools, and wait for it, 255 saloons. They used these surveys to lobby for legislation and city services to help families and clean up the city. As settlement house workers came up against resistance, more of these reformers realized women needed the vote. For them, arguing for the vote based on these concerns made the most sense. So as we get to see, by the end of the Gilded Age, there were numerous people who were arguing for women's suffrage. The true believers of the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association had provided a base for the suffrage movement. But by 1890, now there were club women, settlement house workers, and other reformers who saw the benefits of women voting. Now there was more than just a base, but a large group of women and men to add to the demand, and many of these people will come together under a new group called the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So the women's suffrage movement in 1890 went from a minor fringe movement with little hope for national success to one of a mainstream movement within the cultural context of progressive reform. That included more men and women willing to accept the idea of women's suffrage, and more men. There were numerous male reformers who could now see women voting as a boon for the movement. You can see the change in the numbers. With the change in purpose, we all saw a change in leadership. Anthony, Stanton, and the women of their cohort were aging. Many were still around, and Anthony stayed involved during the Progressive era, even though she was in her 70s. But clearly they came from a different time, and there were young women who could bring energy, relevance, and new ideas to the movement. Carrie Chapman Catt is one of the new leaders that emerged. She served as president of the NAWSA from 1900 to 1904 and returned in 1915 until the end of the movement when the nation ratified the 19th Amendment. Born Carrie Clinton Lane in Wisconsin and then raised in Iowa, Catt early on defied conventional female roles. Her teachers encouraged her to go on to college even though her parents didn't want her to. Generally, women in the late 19th century needed the support of family members because going to university involved a number of costs from tuition to room and board. While that doesn't sound much different than now, there was no FAFSA and no work study. Moreover, many of the new co-ed schools provided by the federal land-grant law were in the middle of nowhere, so there were not many employment opportunities. Carrie's teacher and other supporters helped her to pay to go to Iowa State College. There are not a lot of positions available to educated women, and Catt, like many others, taught school. She eventually became a superintendent of schools, but had to give up teaching when she married. She first married newspaper editor and publisher Leo Chapman. They moved to California in 1885, where he died, and she was forced to support herself as a newspaper reporter. Eventually, she moved back to Iowa, and in 1890 she was one of the Iowa delegates for the new NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. In that year, she also married a wealthy engineer named George W. Catt. They signed a prenuptial agreement stipulating that she could use several months per year for her suffrage work, and that was quite significant. He was supportive of reform, but Catt well knew after the experience of her father, who refused to support her going to college, that women had no power when under the subjugation of men, whether it be a father or a husband. Catt now had the education, financial resources, and male support to be a committed national suffragist. Another leader worth mentioning is Anna Howard Shaw, who did much to whip the organization into shape. She served as president of NAWSA in the years between Catt's terms. Her letter here is an excerpt demanding greater attention to the Suffrage Association's efforts on the state level. Like Catt and many other women, Shaw prepared to become a teacher, and at 15 years old she accepted a position as a school teacher in the West. Shaw had not been as effective as Catt as president because she was not able to court the major suffrage supporters, reformers and club women. And she also had a bad reputation for disliking men, which put her outside of accepted ideals of womanhood. This demonstrates the power of spheres. While women such as Anthony and Shaw might have wanted to establish the equality of women, the majority of Americans could not accept their arguments as well as they could social housekeeping. With the return of the more experienced Catt, a more acceptable Catt, after Shaw's term, NAWSA members shifted from educating people about the meaning of the vote for women to more methodical modes of pressure, such as buttonholing legislators. Women met with specific legislators to convince them to support suffrage and wear flowers in their lapels buttonholes to indicate their support. These are tactics any modern-day lobbyist could appreciate. As the suffrage movement grew stronger and gained more members in the Progressive era, anti-suffragism took on a new zest and organizational voice. In the 1890s, associations to protest suffrage for women arose, mainly in states where suffrage was strongest. These anti-organizations included men, but were generally led by women. Women similar to those who led the movement they were fighting. These were well-off, educated women active in charities, clubs, and reform. The leaders of the liquor industry were also quite nervous about women's suffrage because of its connection to the social housekeeping movement generally and the WCTU specifically. These folks could appeal to drinkers' fears of losing booze or support the anti-suffrage movement from behind the scenes. Anti-suffragists employed several arguments against the vote. One was based on separate spheres and the disasters that could happen by meshing them together. Men and women who believed wholeheartedly that women lived in separate spheres also believed that women would illicitly enter the man's sphere by voting. Basically, they argued that women were represented in politics by their husbands with the household vote. As a part of this argument, they argued if women did vote, they would vote against their husbands and create disharmony in their families and in society. One senator said that if women got the vote and opposed their men, it would turn society into a state of war and make every home a hell on earth. Some women appreciated the comforts of having to stay out of the public sphere. Without the separations between the male world and the female world, women could be expected to work. For us in the post-feminist world, working seems to be a right, but when you think of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, remember how bad the conditions and wages were for women. What woman would want to work at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company? There were very few career options, so working did not seem like a right worth fighting for to many women. Keep in mind these arguments could be used either way. Reformers argued for and against the vote using separate spheres. This really demonstrates the importance of this idea in society at the time. Anti-suffragists could use the same argument because these ideas were so prevalent in American society. Just as there were women who had different reasons for wanting the vote, there were different reasons to argue against it. Keep in mind that the emergence of such a vigorous anti-suffrage movement tells us that the suffrage movement was finally making some progress after 1890. The liquor industry was probably the most nervous about this kind of progress, and the anti-suffragists found it to be a powerful, financially strong ally. Let's take California as an example of how the liquor industry could work against suffragists. In 1896, Susan B. Anthony and Anna Howard Shaw relocated to California to help suffragists there prepare for the general election where voters could vote to allow California women to have suffrage. Anthony and Shaw saw California as a crucial test, and the NAWSA targeted the state with support. Most of the action took place in San Francisco. There, the WCTU and suffragists rallied for women's suffrage based on a campaign of home and family. And the San Francisco Liquors Dealer Association backed the anti-suffragists, warning drinkers that women's suffrage would lead to prohibition. One historian notes that that was an effective argument, since San Francisco had the highest per capita density of saloons of any major city in the country. There was one saloon for every 218 persons. Women's suffrage was defeated that year by 74%, with the highest turnout of voters compared to other elections that year. California women finally got the vote in 1911, but it was a long, bitter contest. When Catt took over the NAWSA in 1915, several events had showed that suffrage was becoming a more mainstream movement. First, in 1912, a third party known as the Progressive Party endorsed women's suffrage at a time when neither the two dominant parties would. Teddy Roosevelt had returned to run for president under a new banner based on reform, and he understood that women were enthusiastic supporters of progressivism. The second event may have been even bigger. The General Federation of Women's Clubs resolved in 1914 to support suffrage. Middle-class women in hundreds of clubs would have taken this endorsement seriously. The third event had to do with the suffrage victory I just told you about in California. Between 1910 and 1914, numerous western states gave suffrage to women. These included places like Washington, Arizona, Montana, in addition to California. So it seemed in 1915, when Carrie Chapman Catt took the helm again, her skill, personality, and ideas would lead the NAWSA and suffragists to victory. But a faction formed in the group to resurrect the Federal Amendment campaign. A third generation of suffragists emerged, frustrated and more radical, under the leadership of Alice Paul. Paul was a Quaker who had spent some time in England with suffragists there. English suffragists had gone to jail, held hunger strikes while in prison, and ended up being force-fed, all to demand the vote. She also witnessed how suffragists in England marched in protest and attacked the party in power. These last tactics she brought with her, but found only few in the NAWSA interested. This faction first called itself the Congressional Union, but soon broke off to form the National Woman's Party in 1916. The National Woman's Party started attacking the Democrats in office. At this point, it was President Wilson. War had erupted in Europe just 2 years before, and President Wilson had his hands full. In 1917, Paul and others picketed the White House, and many went on hunger strikes while in jail. This brought attention, interest, and antipathy to the movement. The NAWSA was embarrassed by all this, but used the pressure against politicians to their advantage. At one point, Kat said she didn't know if the vote was a right, a duty, or a privilege, but whatever it is, women want it. A second bump in the road came in the United States' entrance into World War I. President Wilson had promised to keep American boys out of the war, but then told Americans they needed to fight this war to save democracy for everybody. 86 delegates from all the major women's groups formed the Women's Peace Party in 1915 to oppose the war. Kat, Adams, and a variety of other suffragists opposed the war, stating they presented the views of the mother half of humanity. Jeanette Rankin out of Montana was the first woman in Congress, and she had been the lone dissenting voice against America's involvement in World War I. Initially, this divided the suffrage leadership from most of the NAWSA members. Middle-class women supported the war, generally, and got involved in selling bonds, saving food, and organizing benefits for the soldiers. The NAWSA and Kat realized they needed to deal with this division despite true anti-war sentiments. Kat used Wilson's rhetoric about the war, about saving the world for democracy, and asked him to support a federal amendment because she said it was a war measure. Finally, to get the protesters off the White House sidewalk, Wilson heard Kat's arguments in person. She argued the fight for democracy started at home. Soon after, he went to Congress and supported the amendment to the Constitution, soon known as the 19th Amendment. On January 10, 1918, the House passed a woman suffrage amendment, and then the Senate approved it in June 1919. The long-suffering women's rights activists took their fight to the states, buttonholing legislators to vote for ratification. By August 26, 1920, the required number of states, that was 36 at the time, ratified the amendment. But what did this all mean? The Progressive Era and the Progressives' ideas about women voting promised to change the nation and the world. They looked at problems and ways to solve them, and reformers did get a lot done. Yet there were still problems. But by the time the 1920s rolled around, Americans were no longer interested in reform, including many women. After all this effort, scholars know that women of the 1920s voted along the same lines as their husbands based on race, class, and political affiliations. Giving women the vote did, however, divorce alcohol from politics. 7 states, including Indiana, still ban alcohol sales on Election Day. Voters don't vote with the help of saloon keepers, but go to schools, churches, and other family-friendly buildings to vote. We can only know the result of the period by looking at the 1920s, and that is another story for another day. Thank you for joining me today. I hope that this information will help you in your studies. We all hope to see you at PNC when you are done with your high school degree.